Hello everyone, I'm Vikas Upadhyay, co-founder sentra.world.
Today, we will be discussing about scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3.
So the first one, which is scope 1 emission, is all the emission that is happening within your plant. In a factory, you are consuming coal, you're consuming natural gas, you're consuming diesel, etc. All these are classified as scope 1 emissions. Within that also there are certain classifications whether to account into scope 1 for fuels versus company vehicles, etc. So that's a nuance. uh, the second one biggest category of scope 1 is raw material consumption. So all the raw material that you consume contribute different levels of carbon within them. When you use, there is certain emissions happening within the plant boundaries, so you called it scope 1. The second one, which is scope 2, is all the electricity, heat, and steam that you are consuming, either you are purchasing or not. They come under scope 2 emissions. Yeah? So all the emissions, which is heat, electricity, steam. Scope 3 is the most complicated, and this is where we'll spend most of our time. So scope 3 can be divided into two parts: scope 3 upstream, scope 3 downstream. Scope 3 upstream is means all the emission that is coming to you from your supplier to your factory gates. Scope 3 downstream, whereas, is all the emission that you are passing on to your customers, which is starting from your factory gate all the way to till the end, if it is consumed or it is recycled, etc. As a, most of the companies, they do report scope 3 upstream. Very few companies also report scope 3 downstream. We will focus on scope 3 upstream in detail, and then we'll do a light touch on scope 3 downstream as well. So scope 3 upstream now breaks down into 7 different categories, subcategories. These subcategories, so scope 3 upstream then breaks down into 8 different subcategories. Out of these 8 subcategories, 4 are the most important that you should always remember as steel company. Number 1 is category 3.1, purchase goods and services. Number 2 is fuel, category number 3.3, fuel and energy related activities. Number 3 is category 3.4, transportation and distribution, coming from upstream. And number 4 is category 3.5, waste generated in operations. The other 4, which is leased assets, capital goods, business travel, and employee commuting, they contribute less than 1% or even sometimes 0.01%. So my recommendation, focus on the first 4 categories I talked about. That's the most important. Within that also, category 3.1 is something that everyone should report, because that's where the largest scope 3 emissions are sitting for a manufacturing company. Within purchase goods and services means all the raw materials that you have purchased was manufactured in your supplier's factory. The emission that happened in your supplier's factory gates, that has to be accounted in scope 3, purchase goods and services. So do report that one. And then another important one is the category 3.3 I talked about, fuel and energy related activities. So all the fuel, diesel, coal, or fuel oil, petrol, etc., that you consume, they have emitted emission while their extraction and processing. So that has to be under category 3.3. From your supplier to you, it has been transported either through sea, rail, road, or sometimes air. All these emissions come under scope 3, transportation and distribution, which is category 3.4. And the last most important one that I talked about is waste generated in operations. Very tricky one. You have to account for all the waste that is happening, but within that, slag is, for steel industry, slag is the most important. Do consider that. And again, different methodologies treat slag differently, which we talk about when we go in detail. But do calculate the emissions attributed to slag. Other ones, you will hear business travel, employee commuting. Trust me, super small, less than 1%. If you can collect, of course, do report. If you can't, don't sweat on it. focus on the four categories that are important, then you can slowly add others. Scope 3 downstream, very light touch. The most important there is the downstream transportation and distribution, which is the one wherein you are shipping your products to your customers through either trucks, rail, or ship, sometimes air again. So you can calculate the emission and give it that to your customers. Yeah, that's your scope 3 downstream. Other ones, processing of sold goods, use of sold goods, end of life treatment of sold goods. These are complicated concepts, and these are more relevant when you do a full LCA, which again we'll talk about in later podcasts. We'll talk about it more in more detail. So that's scope 1, scope 2, scope 3. Just as a recap, scope 1, most important, all the emissions that are sitting within your factory gates. This contributes typically in a blast furnace route around more than 70% of your emissions, mainly coming from coal. In a EF route, it will be slightly less, because because you might be consuming a lot of scrap, so emissions will be lower. Contribution of scope 1. Electricity, very important, which is scope 2. Again, in for a blast furnace route, it will be somewhere around 10-15% max. In electric arc furnace, it will be larger. Sometimes it goes up to 50%, depending on if you are further downstream. Scope 3 in a blast furnace route should be less than 20% most cases. And if you're getting credits in certain other methodologies, it will even be lower. At the same time, for uh, companies which are further downstream, scope 3 will become larger. It can go as high as 90% or even 95% if you're further downstream and you're buying intermediate products like billets and slabs, etc., and then processing. So do focus on what are the key scope emissions, and calculate it accordingly.